Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive.
Yeah.
Today we've got some fascinating excerpts that you sent in, and they're all about these ideas of like inner and outer realms. And what really stood out to me was this connection to the Four Noble Truths.
Yeah.
Have you had a chance to look these over?
I have. Yeah, they're really
But
interesting.
this is what struck you.
Well, the thing that kind of jumped out at me right away was just how they describe the human body. It's almost like they're taking inventory, just like listing out all the different pieces and parts.
Yeah, it's very specific.
It is, yeah. It's like hair, again, teeth, skin, nails,
See.
flesh, sinews, bones, marrow brain, blood, sweat, tears, snot, saliva, phlegm, pus, lymph, blood, fat.
Okay, we get it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and they do that for every element, like earth, water, fire, wind.
It's like they're really driving home this point about our physicality.
Yeah,
It's almost uncomfortable the way they go into such detail.
it is, and I think they're doing that to contrast it with the way they talk about the outer realm.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, the outer realms are always described as great, pure, non-abhorrent. So you have this kind of almost uncomfortable density on one side, and then this vast spaciousness on the other.
So it's like they're highlighting how limited our inner perspective is compared to the vastness of the outer realms.
Exactly. And they do that with each element. Like you look at the inner water realm and it's all about, bodily fluids, blood, sweat, tears.
Right, very internal.
Yeah, very much focused on like the physical workings of the body. But then when they talk about the outer water realm again, it's great, pure, cleansed, elevated.
It's interesting how they apply that to fire as well.
Yeah.
Like the inner fire is all about body temperature and digestion, very basic functions.
Yeah, very primal almost.
But then the outer fire realm is described in this really expansive way.
Right, like it's something way beyond our immediate experience.
And then there's the wind element, right, with all its internal movements, the breathing, the energy flow.
Yeah, and that actually makes me think about how we often feel those inner winds the most strongly when we're experiencing intense emotions.
Well, that's a good point.
And that's what brings us to the second excerpt and the Four Noble Truths. Body, mind, emotions, dharma. Because this is where it starts to connect to a path of understanding. It specifically talks about mindfulness of the body.
Which seems a little counterintuitive given all the gross stuff we just talked about.
Right. And especially because it says that the body is falsely called the body.
Yeah, that's a head scratcher.
Yeah.
What do they mean by that?
Well, this is where those elements come back into play, because the excerpt explains that what we call the body is actually just a temporary combination of earth, water, fire, and wind.
The same elements that exist everywhere else.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's false in the sense that we think of it as this solid separate me, when really it's just a collection of elements that are constantly changing and interacting.
So it's like we're not as separate from the world as we think we are.
Right. And that's where things start to get really interesting.
Okay, well, let's dig into that. But first, a quick word from our sponsors. We'll be right back.
Sounds good.
And we're back. All right, so before the break, we were talking about how the body is actually made up of these elements, earth, water, fire, and wind. And it's not really this solid, separate thing that we think it is.
Right. It's more like a process, a constant flow of change.
Yeah, and that makes the whole idea of mindfulness of the body even more interesting to me.
It's like instead of just trying to calm our thoughts, we're actually paying attention to the physical sensations.
To the elements themselves.
Exactly. Like feeling your breath or the warmth of your skin or the subtlest movements within.
Yeah, and, even just thinking about it now, I can feel like the pressure of my feet on the ground or the gentle rise and fall of my chest as I breathe.
Right. It's a different way of experiencing yourself. Not as a fixed thing, but as a process.
And as we become more aware of these sensations, do you think it changes how we relate to our emotions?
Oh, absolutely. Because often when we're caught up in a strong emotion, it's like we get swept away by the story our mind is creating. But if we can bring our attention back to the body, to the physical sensations, it creates some space.
Between us and the emotion.
Exactly. Like instead of being consumed by anger or fear, we can start to observe it, understand it, and maybe even choose how we want to respond.
That sounds pretty powerful.
It is. And that's really what the Four Noble Truths are all about. It's a path to liberation from suffering. And it's not about denying our emotions or trying to force them away.
Right. It's more about understanding them, seeing them as impermanent.
Exactly. They arise, they pass away. Just like everything else.
Like waves in the ocean.
Exactly. And that realization can be incredibly liberating.
Because it helps us to detach from this idea that our emotions define us.
Right. We start to see them as just part of the flow of experience.
It's interesting to think about how all these concepts we're talking about, inner and outer realms, mindfulness, They're all rooted in our physical experience.
Yeah, it's not just airy-fairy philosophy. This is about how we actually experience ourselves in the world.
Speaking of experience, the first excerpt also mentioned that the body is like the root of our senses.
Oh, right, right. It said something about like the body created are the roots of the eyes, the ears, and the unmanifested colors.
Yeah, what do you think they meant by that?
Well, I think they're highlighting that even our experience of the outer realms is filtered through our senses.
Which are rooted in the body.
Exactly. So even though we might talk about these vast transcendent realms, we can only access them through our physical form.
So it all comes back to the body.
It does. And it really emphasizes this interconnectedness of everything. You know, we can't truly separate inner and outer experience.
They're always influencing each other.
Exactly.
This makes me wonder if we cultivate more mindfulness of the body. Does that change how we perceive the outer world as well?
That's a great question. And honestly, it's something we could probably spend hours unpacking.
Yeah, there's so much to explore here.
There is.
But maybe we should take a step back for a second and just summarize what we've covered so far.
Yeah, good idea. Let's do a little recap.
Okay, so we started with this idea of inner and outer realms and how these excerpts use really detailed descriptions of the body to kind of illustrate that division.
Right. But then we talked about how the body itself isn't actually this solid, separate thing. It's more like a collection of elements that are constantly changing and interacting.
Which blurs the lines between inner and outer.
Exactly. And we connected that back to the Four Noble Truths and the idea of mindfulness of the body as a way to observe those elements and the sensations without judgment.
And that led us to discussing how mindfulness can help us navigate difficult emotions and recognize that they're impermanent.
Right, and how that can be really liberating.
We also talked about how our senses, which are rooted in the body, shape our experience of both the inner and outer realms.
So even as we're exploring these vast concepts, it's always through the lens of our own physicality.
Which brings us to this really fascinating question of whether cultivating mindfulness of the body can actually change how we perceive the world around us.
It's like we've only just scratched the surface here.
I know there's so much more to explore. And speaking of exploring, the second part of the Four Noble Truths focuses on the mind.
Oh, the mind.
Which is a whole other deep dive waiting to happen.
Yeah.
But for now, I think we need to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll be diving into the mind and its connection to these inner and outer realms. So stay tuned.
Welcome back. So we've been talking about how our senses are rooted in the body and how that shapes our experience of the world. But it makes you wonder, if we change how we relate to our body, does that change how we actually perceive things out there?
It really challenges that traditional view of the mind as being completely separate from the body, doesn't it?
Yeah, like instead of the mind being this detached observer, it's more like the mind and body are constantly influencing each other.
Exactly. And if we go back to that idea of the body being the root of the senses, it suggests that how we perceive those outer realms is deeply connected to the state of our body.
So it's not just about what we're seeing and hearing, but also about how our body is feeling in that moment. Yeah, exactly. Like if you're feeling tense and anxious, you're probably going to experience the world a lot differently than if you're relaxed and grounded.
That makes sense. So where does mindfulness fit into all of this?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting, because by paying attention to those sensations in our body, the tightness, the ease, the flow of energy, we can actually start to shift our mental and emotional state.
So it's not just about calming the mind, it's about cultivating a different kind of awareness in the body.
Exactly. And as you become more attuned to that inner world, you might start to see the outer world in a whole new light.
The boundaries between inner and outer start to blur.
Yeah. You might even feel a greater sense of connection to nature, to other people, to the whole mystery of existence.
That's amazing. It's like by exploring this universe within, we actually discover a deeper connection to the universe without.
And that's what makes these excerpts so profound. It's not just about hair and sweat and internal winds. It's about understanding the interconnectedness of everything.
And the power of mindfulness to help us see that. Well, this has been an incredible deep dive. So much to think about.
I know, right?
But unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today.
Ooh.
A huge thank you to you for sharing your insights and for helping us unpack these really complex ideas.
My pleasure. It's always fun to dive into these topics.
And everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this journey. And remember, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the mysteries of inner and outer realms. We'll see you next time.